Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage!
Okay. Alright, guys. Back again, doing a rare daytime video. I should be looking for a job. And by the way, anybody that lives in North Jersey that has a job that they can let me know about, that would be great. But I'm due for a video, and kind of have been shuffling around for an idea of what to do it on. And was actually out in the garage on one of the warmer days, flipping through stuff. I came across a couple ideas. I guess I could always do a video on what I've been listening to, but it gets a bit boring because I tend to focus on one artist and exclusively play a specific artist for sometimes like a week at a time, and then only various other artists' CDs or albums, slot one in here and there. So instead of doing that, which I don't know how much value that has, I kind of came up with something that I'll do in the, maybe as part of a series. And if anybody wants to pick up on it as a thread, be my guest. I'd love to see and hear it and see what your thoughts are. I'm going to do at least a couple of these. And the theme is, I picked a dozen, though, it's kind of at random, of my favorite album covers. I did do a video some time ago, quite a long time ago, on records that I bought simply because I liked the album covers, even though the genre of music was already something I was into, like jazz or something. This is a little different. This is albums that I picked up for the music, but that turned out to be amongst favorites. And I'm not going to say this is my top dozen favorite album covers. I'll point that out when the time gets to, the few that I have that are definitely up there in terms of favorite images or whatever. But this is just a dozen of the ones that I kind of randomly came across, somewhere in the garage, somewhere here on the floor back there, that I have, that I thought, oh, this is great album cover. And maybe talk about the music on the album a little bit. And, there's not going to be a lot of surprises here. These are probably almost all albums, except for one or two that I've already shown in my videos to talk about maybe musically. But I stuck to vinyl here only because the contrast between a big, holding up a big 12-inch album to the screen and then a little CD booklet is too much of a contrast. So I'll definitely at one point be doing one that's strictly things on CD, things that probably never came out on vinyl because of the time frame that they were issued. Because I definitely have some favorite CD album covers that I wish were on vinyl, that I would buy the vinyl edition and never open it just to have the nice big cover photo. So no big surprise. Oh, this time I remembered to turn on my tiki lights. So for some ambiance there. And you can't quite see it on the back wall there. I'm going to see if I can focus on that a little bit. Look at that live high-tech stuff, people. That's a rubber chicken doing Pilates on my back wall. Don't know how he got there, but he's doing the Pilates. I'm leaving him alone. I hope that comes out on video. Okay, so no big surprise that, this is about the third time I'm trying to start this video. I've had various problems, technical issues as always, so hopefully this time will fly. I've decided to keep this down to only 7 hours because I realize many people out there actually work for a living. So I have here 12 albums. Not a lot of surprises that there's ECMs all over in the batch. Here's a favorite album cover, and I definitely have a glare issue here. I'm gonna try to tilt any way that I can to avoid it. This is a very popular album. Could be the most popular album I'm going to show, just about. John Abercrombie's first solo album, the late great John Abercrombie, Timeless. Not really a typical ECM album cover. There's no frame on it. The image takes up the full um, album cover. Very simple but nice. I like this kind of artwork. And a lot of people love this album. It's very fusiony with, Jan Hammer on it, the trio. As you can see, with just Jan Hammer on keyboards and Jack DeJohnette on drums. I like the acoustic things on here. There's 6 pieces, 2 of them are acoustic, and then there's the Timeless piece itself, which is really good. But even in an interview I read with John Abercrombie, he said he wasn't quite as fond of the more fusiony, up-tempo stuff, which does sound kind of dated. Still an album I do play from time to time, actually. And quite a few tracks ended up on the 2 compilation albums that ECM put out, one called Works and the other one Rarum. There was at least 3 tracks between those, which is half the album, on those compilation albums. But oddly enough, both of those compilations left out my 2 favorite tracks. The 2 acoustic tracks on here, which have piano and acoustic guitar, are just really nice. John's first, not his best in my opinion, but still a worthwhile listen. Here's another great album. This is a photo. Terje Reptle's Whenever I Seem to Be Far Away. And this definitely ranks up there as well with my favorite albums of his. This could be the first of his that I consider a classic. My favorite is After the Rain, which I think was the one that he recorded right after that, or maybe 2 albums after this. I think it might have been the one he recorded right after this. His earlier albums for me on ECM were a bit too like the Miles Davis 1970s fusion stuff. There's a lot of funk grooves that didn't go anywhere and were just pretty much static while the soloist played over them. And I really don't listen to them very much, to be honest, and I'm not a huge fan of them. A couple of them I only have on LP, and I buy everything on CD that I possibly can. And there's a couple early Terje Reptles that I didn't even attempt to get on CD. I mean, someday maybe. But, he did a lot of early, prior to this. This was from 1974. He did a lot of kind of dated fusion things. With the bass vamp just playing the same few notes over and over for like 15 minutes while people soloed over it. It's the first album where he kind of got away from that. Very much, it's a short album. It's under 40 minutes. 2 sides to it. 2 different sides musically, recorded in 1974. There's a band thing, which is, like his larger bands. He's got the bass player, keyboard player that plays Mellotron, which sounds great, French horn player, and John Christensen on drums and percussion, and Terje on guitar, as well as the members of the Sudfunk Symphony Orchestra. And the half of this album that has the band, that has a rhythm section with drums and bass and keyboards, to me is better than all of the previous things that he did in the earlier 70s. It's just 20 minutes of band material. Again, there's one long track, 14 minutes, and a shorter track, 5 minutes. It's similar to the stuff he was doing before, but maybe there's a little bit more dynamics in there that was lacking before. And it's a good listen. Maybe if the whole album had been just the band thing, I wouldn't rate it as highly. But the second side is Terje's first orchestral recording. There's no band playing, no rhythm section, keyboard player, or anything. It's just the string section and Terje's electric guitar. And that's an 17 and a half minute piece, which is the title track, Whenever I Seem to Be Far Away. And that really hits home for me. I really like that piece. There's no rhythms that you can pick up on because it's just the string orchestra and Terje's guitar. And, it definitely, Terje's done full albums many years later of this type of music for string orchestra and guitar, sometimes just for string orchestra where he doesn't play guitar at all. But for me, this definitely ranks up there with, this is when I want to hear Terje play with the string orchestra without the rhythm section of a band playing along. This is still the first album I go to. And that fantastic cover. Fantastic cover. I cheated and I have two albums by the same group here. More ECM. I just love this. Here's another non-typical ECM album cover. Azimuth, the great trio of John Taylor on piano, and on this album only, he also plays synthesizer. The late Kenny Wheeler on trumpet and flugelhorn, and John Taylor's now passed away as well, and Norma Winstone on voice, vocals. And this is the only, this is a very unusual cover photograph that ECM usually doesn't go this way. I really dig this. I don't know if it really speaks to the music, but, whenever I'd play the music, you get that thing that when you buy an album like this with a cover image that you like, kind of that sticks with you. Whenever you play the music, even, whether it's in an iPod or, without even pulling the physical album out, whenever I play this music, which is fairly frequently, this is my favorite Azimuth album, from 1977, I believe. Yeah, recorded in March 77. Whenever I pull this out and listen to this, the first thing that comes to mind is the cover image. And that's really the case with pretty much all these albums. Anyone that I love the album cover by, that's what happens. I'm going to go with another Azimuth album quite a few years later, 1985. This would be their fourth album. Is another, and this one definitely ranks up there in terms of musicals too. I rank this album very highly in their output. The same trio, John Taylor on piano. He plays a little bit of organ on here. No more synthesizer, unfortunately. Norma Winstone on vocals and Kenny Wheeler again. Great cover photograph. This really speaks to the music. I think this is very apropos to the music. It's kind of a reflective kind of, if you hear the lineup, there's no additional musicians on this. It's strictly a trio. And, there's no rhythm section. So you've got the piano and the voice and the trumpet. So it has, maybe at times it's a little rhythmic, but it doesn't get locked into a rhythmic groove. So, this is the stuff of daydreams. Yes, this is great daydream music. And for years, I always thought this would be the kind of music. Now I go way back. I started listening to Azimuth in 78 and started picking up the albums as they were released. So I go back a lot of years with them. For many years, I thought this would not ever be the kind of thing you would play in a car because of the lack of rhythmic drive. And the things I play in the car tend to have a little bit more of a steady rhythm. But I know my friend Carm said, he has played Azimuth. I'm sure he told me in the car. And then I recall that once I did try it once. And I'd say if you're traveling, it doesn't really work if you're in a busy daytime traffic jam kind of place. But, you can do it. Driving at night, I did have a recording. I can't record now whether it was when at one point I had a cassette, I know, but of their music that I made from the albums. But I think after that, I did also do a drive with a CD in the car of their music at night. When it's quiet and there's not a lot of traffic, kind of thing. This goes really well. Not maybe if you're sleepy, but it's very night-centric music anyway. But I can't see listening to it when you're driving to and from work, kind of thing, or have a schedule where you have to be somewhere. But this is some of the most picturesque music I think I've ever heard. Right up there when I first started discovering things outside of rock music, and I first came across guys like a Klaus Schulze or something like that. And to me, all of a sudden, I was not listening to music with lyrics and music that didn't have like a real heavy rhythm section or rock beat to it or something like that. The more impressionistic and abstract you get, the more images come to mind when I tend to listen to music. And this is one of those albums. The whole group really, but this and the really all of their albums are just some of the most image-centric music that I've ever heard. And I just love that cover. And sticking with the theme of the same artist, of course, I would bring in Maja Weber, Eberhard Weber's late wife, who always designed his album covers and also did a few other album covers. I know she did Bill Frisell's first solo album. Yeah, there's another one I just came across recently that on ECM that I had forgotten that she had designed the cover for, because most of Maja Weber's work was done for her husband's album covers, Eberhard Weber. So here's Later That Evening. Remember buying this when it came out, seeing it in the record store as a new release. Her things are very cartoony, but I very much love them. And a lot of people put this amongst his best albums. I don't. This is to me more of his second tier stuff. Because when his albums are great, they're great, and even when they're not quite at that level, they're still great. They're just not. There's a couple tiers of his music for me, and this one is very good for me. But not up to the highest standards of the stuff that he does. But a lot of people disagree. This is one of his top tier albums, and a great album cover, and another one that whenever I play the music, I always recall these are 6 different images that Maja Weber created once again for her husband, Eberhard Weber. Fantastic album. A lot of people don't like this, but there's no rhythm section here, and I think that's what it is. I think people want rhythms that they can hook up onto, but this is more ethereal. This is more closer to the Azimuth stuff. It even has Norma Winstone on vocals, Bonnie Herman on vocals. They're doing voice as a lead instrument, not singing lyrics. And the voice very much like it would be a flute line or 2 flute lines playing in harmony to each other. Eberhard Weber on bass. His very first professional recording session. Bill Frisell on guitars. And Gary Burton on vibes and marimba, and that's it. There's no drummer. It's a fantastic album. This is one of the first albums I got by him, and I was just a year or 2 outside of the rock thing, so it took me a little bit to really fully appreciate it. But no drummer, just the vibraphone and marimba, the guitar, the bass, and the 2 voices. Just a fantastic, unique kind of grouping of instrumentals. And instruments. And he didn't really work with this kind of ensemble again in terms of like the instrumental mix. But this is just one of the best from 1979. And that's it for the ECM stuff. Here's one. I just love this. I remember seeing this on the Kenny Burrell, the mainstream kind of bebop jazz guitar player. Fantastic guitar player, very much in the Wes Montgomery mode. Here's an album, because I can't, that glare is really bad, I know. Something called Moon and Sand. Beautiful album cover. I just like that. It's a great album as well. Kenny Burrell guitar. John Hurd on bass, Ron McCurdy on drums, and Kenneth Nash on percussion. So it's an interesting band. It's basically a trio, a guitar, bass, drums trio with an added percussionist. And Kenneth Nash plays very light hand percussion that goes well with this. It's a nice album. If you know Kenny Burrell, there's going to be standards like Blue Bossa by Kenny Dorham, Love for Sale, Moon and Sand, naturally, a whole bunch of Lost in the Stars. Basically, it's mostly standards, but just done really well. And where's the recording date? December 1979. So I would have bought this in the early 1980s. So it's got the later day clarity that you didn't maybe have in 1950s era recordings of this type of music. And I think the CD of this is out of print. I would love to get this on CD. This is a really, really good, just mainstream, clean jazz. He's such a sophisticated player with those, sophisticated jazz chords and scales and stuff. And it's something that, you don't have to be a connoisseur really to appreciate. It's pretty, it's pretty music at times. It's driving at other times, but not avant-garde at all. Just a really pretty, beautiful, mainstream bebop-oriented jazz guitar album. I also have a love, and this is the only example I have of this here today. I also have a love of kind of like 1950s and early 1960s style pop art, or cartoony art, I guess, for lack of a better term. And this is one of them. Now, I happen to love this group. This is Howard Rumsey's Lighthouse All-Stars. And they put out a series of albums, especially in the 1950s. And the Lighthouse was a club in Hermosa Beach, California, which is still there. It's not a jazz club anymore. I believe it started as a restaurant. And this bass player, Howard Rumsey, I believe the story goes that he went in and saw the restaurant and marveled at its acoustics. And it was a fairly decent size, apparently. I mean, someday I'd love to go see it for myself, even though it's not a jazz club anymore. And approached the manager of the restaurant and said, hey, we could make enough space here and have music performances. Probably be good for business. And, at the time, jazz was popular enough that the manager went for it. And then Howard Rumsey ran it for a lot of years. And there was a basic band of a lot of West Coast jazz musicians that are fairly well known, and probably a lot of guys that worked in the movie studios recording a lot of soundtrack work in the late 50s and 60s and 70s. When jazz started losing its popularity, a lot of these guys, in the West Coast that were anywhere near the Los Angeles area started doing a lot of music soundtracks, which is much more lucrative than playing a club gig. And a lot of these guys had names on their own. So there was a fairly set number of musicians, including Howard Rumsey himself on bass. It's very mainstream, oriented toward a bigger band, with a horn section and everything. And I love the albums that I have, the 4 or 5 albums I have by them from the era. All have revolving musicians and any number of drummers. At one point, Max Roach actually came and stayed for a few months, apparently in California, and was one of the house drummers. But there was a lot of different drummers and pianists and a lot of different horn guys in the group at any given time. And also one of their functions was they would be the backup band for a lot of East Coast visiting musicians. So at one point, Miles Davis came down from New York without his band. Maybe he didn't even have one at the time. And they backed him up. They backed up Miles. Chet Baker came along without a group, and they backed up Chet Baker. And those things have been released on those artists' albums as well, without really much reference to the Lighthouse. But the Lighthouse All-Stars, a hell of a group in terms of the musicians, and they don't have the musicians listed here. Oh yeah, Jimmy Guthrie is one of the guys on here. Bob Cooper, if you read if you're into jazz from the West Coast, from the 50s and 60s era, you might know his name. Shorty Rogers, pianist, Hampton Hawes. Shelly Manne was a big contributor on drums, and Shelly Manne was, because he was known as a leader and recorded all kinds of music for TV and movies. So those are the guys that are on here. Jimmy Guthrie, a whole bunch of other people that I'm not really that familiar with. Maynard Ferguson actually plays on here. These guys are fairly early in their career in a lot of cases. And they would have conga drummers and, more Latin percussionists come in sometimes. So all of their albums, although in, a very tightly arranged format for a big band, but a relatively small big band at times, but a big band always with a horn section. A lot of their albums have slight differences in terms of material and style, which always keeps it interesting. And I love this group. It's very old-timey sounding and fairly, and conservative, because this is not free jazz or anything like that. And it seems to be a kind of jazz that people aren't listening to anymore. I get, when I post up albums, I know free jazz things by, really out there stuff by guys like Derek Bailey get more listens than the kind of, more mainstream stuff like this that, initially back then had more appeal because it was not avant-garde, and, your average Joe on the street could appreciate it. But it's a shame to me that these more structured things, maybe conservative, but still really enjoyable, aren't appreciated more. And I just love the art. Quite a few of their albums have images that very much call. You could just look at the image and say, oh, that record's got to be from the 50s or early 60s. And now, complete other world here. And I've shown this. But how can you not love this album cover? It happens to be one of my favorite Klaus Schulze's very first solo album, Irrlicht, which has a couple different album covers in the vinyl years. I know there was I'm pretty sure this one had a different album cover. I know Cyborg did have at least 2 album covers as well. I just love that. The colors are great. It's a very simple, but very telling to the music inside. And everything is good on this. The front cover, the back cover, and a fantastic image inside, wintry, cold image. That is, oops, I dropped my other albums. But that image inside, too, could be an album cover on its own. And this is, easily one of his most experimental albums. That image could be obviously an album cover by itself. Just fantastic. Grab the vinyl that I dropped. Okay, and here's another, musically, I haven't talked about this. I got to find some place to put this vinyl because it's just perched on my knee, on one knee. I haven't talked about this group. Latitude was, but I love this album cover. There's a lot of album covers that have map kind of things on it, mappy things. But I like the combination of maps with the horizon, in there, and the fading light. Fantastic image. And I knew nothing about this group. This was their first album. On the Lifestyle label, which is a label no longer around that I really did like, a very small label out of Canada, I believe. And yet most of the musicians that I saw on the label were not Canadian. There's some Americans and some Europeans. But the album cover first caught my attention. I was probably going through, I remember the store I bought it in. I was probably going through like miscellaneous jazz, maybe even miscellaneous new age, because this would have been about 1986 or 87. And I just stopped when I saw this album cover. The name meant nothing to me. When I flipped it over, there's also a decent photograph too on the back. When I flipped it over, I knew I was going to buy it right away because it was just a duo, no additional musicians at all, of a keyboardist and a guitarist. And I'm right there. And, a lot of times at this age, when kind of new age was starting, you had albums that were, maybe you'd have keyboard and guitar albums that were like piano and acoustic guitar. But this is very clearly electric. There's electric keyboards and acoustic and electric guitars involved. So I knew it wouldn't be like the kind of Windham Hill thing. And at that point, in 86, Windham Hill was kind of really well established anyway. So I bought it, and it's a guy, Craig Payton, on keyboards, who he's made a bunch of solo albums, which I have. He continued on with Latitude, making a bunch of records as the Latitude group as well. And a guy named Ben Verdery, I think is how you pronounce his name, on guitars. And I always wondered, I didn't see a lot of Ben Verdery stuff. I saw the Latitude albums he made, and I saw one solo album. And then recently I learned that he's been, even at the time that this was done in the 80s, he's one of the guys in charge of a music school somewhere on the West Coast. So he's apparently a very learned musician. The thing I like about this album versus their other albums, well, let me say my first impressions were, I was just expecting electric and acoustic guitars and electric keyboards, mostly from the information on the back. When I put it on, and this was, like very early this might have been late 86 or early 87. I was surprised to hear like a electric bass and drums. See, back then, this was the very, very dawn of sampled instruments, and I had never heard sampled percussion that sounded like real drums until I bought this album. I also never heard electric bass samples that sounded like an electric bass. I've heard bass lines played on keyboards, but you could tell they were played on keyboards. So Craig Payton is very much a technical mastermind. You know, he was one of these guys that knew his equipment inside and out, probably even better than Joe Zawinul, I would say. And he was the first guy. This is the first time I'm like, well, you know, I looked on the credits again, thinking that it's certainly kind of like a funky, very lightly funky, occasional electric bass sound. And I thought, well, maybe Ben Verdery, the guitarist, is playing bass, but he's not credited with playing bass. It was only many years later, you know, after everybody started using these samples, that you could hear now that these are, you know, keyboard bass samples played on the keyboard. And I had never heard the really clean percussion sounds, not electronic percussion sounds, very much the sound of like an acoustic drum kit and light percussion that apparently was also sampled. It was the first time I ever heard those kind of realistic samples anywhere. Courtesy of Craig Payton, who's very much a guy that always kept up with the technology. Even did a track on the Steps Ahead album, roughly around this point, where he played all the instruments on the Steps Ahead track except for, I think, the saxophone done by Mike Brecker. There may have been some Mike Maneri vibes on that track, but I'm not even sure. But Craig Payton, basically, for this one track on the Steps Ahead album, basically replaced the whole band. You know, he played the drum parts and the bass parts and the keyboard parts and everything but the horns. And I'm not even sure Mike Maneri plays even his vibraphone on that one track. So, you know, he was kind of well thought of. And the difference with, you know, if you're ever going to pick up a Latitude album, which, how do I describe it? It's not really fusion. It's definitely not smooth jazz. It's kind of a new age, but there's a song format, you know, because the tracks all run about like 5 minutes, between 4 and 6 minutes. And they're not experimental. They're not spacey. It's not like Berlin School music. You know, there's themes for all of them. The thing that I love about this album that they didn't do on their other albums was, obviously this is a studio band, and they did a lot of overdubbing because you had the bass parts and the percussion parts along with the guitar and the keyboards. But instead of trying to fill up all the sound and make it sound like there's a whole full band playing, it's very low key. You know, the way the percussion and the bass, when it does appear, which isn't all the time through the album, when the percussion and bass do appear, it's very much mixed down and low key. And the guitars, even the electric guitars for the most part, are very clean sounding. So it's not what you would expect so much, even after somebody described the album to you, because then you're expecting some more, you know, fusion-y things with distorted guitars and all that. And I still love this album. They recorded several albums after this with the same two guys, but pretty much with the second album, they started filling up that sound. So the albums sounded busier and fuller, and it sounded more like it was a band playing it. You know, maybe from the second album on, it sounded a bit more like Elements, if you know the Mark Egan band Elements. You know, which had, I think it was Clifford Carter and Mark Egan and Pat Metheny Group's first drummer. You know, that kind of fusion-y thing, I don't know, but not fusion in the sense of like Return to Forever kind of fusion. The later day 80s, cleaner, more thematic, less frantic and hectic fusion. This is a very low-key album. And I like the fact that they didn't try to just make it sound like, oh, we're in the studio, we can do 100 overdubs per song, so let's make it sound like there's a 9-piece band playing here. They kept it low-key, even when the rhythm section kicks in. And the other albums, they started upping the rhythm section a bit more, you know, which was all Craig Payton playing the bass lines on the drums and as well on the keyboards. So the further albums sounded a bit more like a band. I like the more low-key, mellower, cleaner aspect of this album. So this is the one by them, the first one I always pull out whenever I listen to a Latitude recording. Two more also by the same artist, again. Just to prove my love of the Eric Dolphy's Last Date, which is, this is, he plays, a lot of originals, like about half originals and then half covers, including Epistrophe by Thelonious Monk. This was, searching on this real quick, I don't see the recording date on here. But this was apparently a European thing because I see Hans Bennick on drums, who was, who appears on a lot of jazz albums, but they were all recorded in Europe. A bass player I don't know, Jacques Scholz on bass, Misha Mengelberg on piano. And I know this is probably a set band that supported somewhere in Europe, visiting jazz musicians, and Eric Dolphy, flute, bass, clarinet, and alto saxophone. And I went through early 80s or so, I went through an Eric Dolphy period where I bought a lot of his stuff on vinyl. And I got to admit, a lot of times, not knowing which albums to pick up, I'd look up at the musical lineup, and a lot of it's quartets, and a lot of it's, not, a lot of it's the same kind of lineup, usually a lot of quartets. So hey, I'm also pick out an album cover that I like, and I just like this kind of art from that period. I'm sure this is the original album cover as it came out in the 60s. And the last one I have, which is another Eric Dolphy album cover. Now this one could definitely be in the running for my favorite album cover of all time. It's probably too bland for a lot of people, and I never actually took the cellophane off to actually free the album cover from the band on it here. But I just love this. It's called Out There by Eric Dolphy. It's got quite a band on it. It is a very, very early session by a very young Ron Carter on bass, Eric Dolphy saxophone, flute, and clarinets, George Duvivier on bass. If you're into mainstream jazz, you know George's name, and Roy Haynes on drums. So literally the entire four-piece band on here. And interestingly, no piano player. So it's, Dolphy's wind instruments, Ron Carter on cello, and George Duvivier on bass and drums. So interesting, bass, drums, cello, supporting Eric Dolphy, no piano. And I wouldn't say this is real avant-garde. This is, very early in the avant-garde start of things. So it's a combination of, maybe a more mainstream jazz that you might know, but starting to get a little bit out there, like the title suggests. And, Jesus, do I have this on? I don't know if I even have this on CD yet. As you can guess, the recording engineered quality isn't the greatest, because of the time period. And I'm sure this album sounded incredibly avant-garde to the guys that were recording it at the time, and probably most listeners too. And, with studio engineers, they probably didn't even know how to record it. Not knowing, I've recorded cello and upright bass before, but not with a drummer in a jazz context. And I just love, this could be, there's the standard 1950s style liner notes on the back. This is obviously the reissued thing that came out in the early 80s when they started. All these sessions had been available on twofer albums, but when they did the twofers, they made new album covers. Most of the twofers were done in the 70s, and they would put some kind of contemporary 70s art on there. And then all of a sudden, these things really took off when they decided, let's just reissue these with the original album covers from the era. And this really kind of speaks as, you wouldn't see an album cover like this in the 70s or 80s or after that. And I just love this, the whole imagery on this. I'd love to have this on a poster and just cover my entire wall with that image. The floating cello and the music, the music sheets of music, and I guess that's a cymbal, a drum cymbal on there, and the metronome. It's just, I just love that image. And I love the colors. The colors are very warm. I don't know if you would say it pops. It doesn't pretty much pop out so much on the shelves, but it did when I saw it. When I saw it, because I'm drawn to images like this, and not a bad little album either. So once again, this went on much longer than I anticipated it would, but that's a start of a potential series. It's pulling together artists that really have no association with each other outside of the fact that I like the albums and I like the album covers. So that might be a good way to maybe bring some things into the light that might not have seen the light of day otherwise. So, and at least, until I can get back out in the garage and do random vinyl pulls, maybe I'll do this, and next time maybe more vinyl, maybe I'll do, CD album covers that I love, things that never got the larger vinyl issues, or whatever. And if anybody likes this enough to pick up on it on a thread, that's great. So that's it. 12 albums there. All things that I love to listen to, but I also love the album covers. And I hope everybody's doing well. I hope you appreciated the fact that the Rubber Chicken is still doing the Pilates on the back wall and hasn't fallen off yet. And I got my mood tiki lighting going again, which I forgot to do the last couple times. And hope everybody's doing well, and hope to hear from you soon. Take care.